Take the living bread of life, take the cup of sacrifice, do this in memory of me.
On this third Sunday of Advent, we should all be singing the song, "So We Need a Little Christmas Right This Very Minute." You know that one? You know what musical it was from? Very good name. One of the great musicals of all time. This Sunday is officially called Gaudete Sunday, rejoice. Comes from that second reading we heard from Paul's letter to the Thessalonians. I like to call it Are We There Yet Sunday. You know, if you've ever driven in a car with young children, are we there yet? Are we there yet? That's the feeling that the liturgy has. It's certainly the image the opening prayer gives us as we prayed, "O Lord, see all your faithful people standing here, waiting to celebrate the nativity of your Son." Of course, we see that great anticipation in the eyes and in the words of young children who await the wonderful celebration of Christmas. And for children, the time between Thanksgiving and Christmas can seem like an eternity. But you know, the time between our salvation and the coming of Christ, likewise, at times can seem like an eternity. And like the psalmist, we often find ourselves saying, "How long, O Lord, how long?" You know, I don't mind being faithful, I don't mind being your disciples, but it's pretty tough down here. Things are difficult. How long will it be until you finally come again and set things aright? The readings today are two, both from Isaiah and 1 Thessalonians, two of the most cherished biblical readings in the church. The reading from Isaiah, the 61st chapter, remember, is the reading that Jesus used when he began his ministry. When he was in the synagogue and they handed him the Torah scroll, he opened it and read this passage from the prophet Isaiah. And what does it say? "The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, for he has anointed me. He has sent me to bring glad tidings to the poor." There's that word again, glad tidings, that we saw last week when we read the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, Son of God, from the opening line of Mark's gospel. And those glad tidings, we translate as gospel, were not words that were associated with any religion. They were words that were associated with the emperor. It was a chant of victory. And so Jesus comes to sing a chant of victory to the poor, to the brokenhearted, to remind us that ultimately the time will come when all the injustices that we suffer, all the wrongs that occur in this world will be finally made right. And then Jesus comes to heal the brokenhearted. You know, every one of us is brokenhearted in our own way, and not just because of all the curveballs and the hurts that life throws at us. Sometimes they're pretty deep, they're pretty crippling. But our hearts are mostly broken because they are not completely focused on the one thing that really matters. And so our hearts tend to be broken into little pieces. And each piece vies for our attention. Each piece wants to be number one. And we think somehow if we can just satisfy all the little yearnings of our heart, all will be well. But it never seems to happen. And that, of course, because it's a fool's errand. Unless there is a unifying principle, then our hearts remain broken into pieces, one pitted against the other. But if we allow God to be the unifying principle of our souls, of our hearts, then we are made whole once again. But I have to tell you, in order to do that, it does take some spiritual work. That's where Paul's advice to the Thessalonians comes in quite handy. And again, this, like the reading from Isaiah, is one of the most cherished readings in the Christian community. Certainly the oldest of all the written documents of the New Testament. It was written well before any of the Gospels were written, probably written somewhere in the early part of the 50s. So for a long, long time, the Christian community has been hearing Paul's practical advice that he gives to the Thessalonians. And he says to them, "Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, in all circumstances give thanks, don't stifle the Spirit, don't despise prophecies, test everything, cling to what is good, and drop what is evil like a hot potato." We look at that a little more closely, see how difficult it can be. I mean, to rejoice always, there's a lot of things that make us sad. There's a lot of tragedies that we often face. And so rejoicing always is a lot easier said than done. Yet, it's not just being happy based on circumstance, it's having that joy, that deep serenity that comes from knowing that despite the darkness, despite the storm, ultimately everything will be all right. And to do this, I think, is like learning a new language. You know, when you're young, when you're first learning to speak as a toddler, you don't know that you're using nouns and pronouns and verbs and adjectives and so forth. You just start to speak. But when you try to learn a new language, when you're older, you have to study some of the rules of grammar. You have to learn certainly a whole lot of vocabulary before you can approach that language to speak it with any sense of fluency. And if you're always thinking about the rules of grammar, you really can't speak too well. So think of it in Spanish or in Italian. Nouns and pronouns are either masculine or feminine, which is different in English. Most nouns, pronouns are neuter. And you also have to know in Spanish or Italian that if whatever gender the noun is, it has to match the definite article and the adjective and so forth and so on. Once you get that simple rule, you can begin to use words correctly. You begin to master the basics of a language, and as you internalize them, you don't think about them so much, you just speak, and the words come out in the proper order. But it takes practice. Well, so do the spiritual rules or the spiritual laws that Paul lays down for us in this first letter to the Thessalonians. It takes practice. One of the things we've been trying to do, I hope you've been trying to do during Advent, is to keep a gratitude list. Because a gratitude list is a great place to start. Because it helps to shift your perspective from seeing the glass half empty to seeing the glass half full. And when you do that, giving thanks in all circumstances certainly becomes a lot easier. Because even in difficult circumstances, in trying circumstances, you're able to see some blessing disguised in the whole thing. And you can indeed give thanks even then. And the more we do this, the more the longer a track record we get. The longer track record we get, the more we could look back and see how the hand of God was guiding us through all circumstances in our lives. It's like that wonderful poem, Footprints in the Sand, when the person says to God, at the most difficult times of life, I noticed there's only one set of footprints. Where were you? God says, it's then, my child, that I was carrying you. Finally, we meet once again our friend John the Baptist in the gospel. John is a strange, fearsome figure. He wears camel hair, which if you ever wore camel hair, it's not real comfortable, kind of itchy. And he eats locust and wild honey. I've eaten wild honey. I've never tried a locust, but I think I will someday. But I like John a lot because he really has no ego. John knew who he was, but he also knew who he wasn't. And he refused, as we hear in the gospel today, to accept the titles that people were trying to give him. Are you Elijah? Are you the prophet? Are you the one who is to come? John says no to all of that. I am not the one. I am not the prophet. I am merely the voice of one in the desert crying out, prepare the way of the Lord. In other words, John knew what his role was. And John performed his role very well. And he wasn't even sure if Jesus was the Messiah at first, as the Gospels tell us. But that didn't stop him from doing what he knew he had to do, point the way to the one who was coming right after him. And that, I think, made him all the more effective, all the more authentic, because he wasn't trying to be someone he wasn't. He was glad to fulfill his role in the plan of God's making salvation unfold for us. Think of any great person who's really made an impact. They know who they are. Someone like Blessed Mother Teresa of Calcutta. She knew she wasn't going to change the world. She knew she wasn't going to right all the wrongs that existed, to deal with every social injustice that existed. And so she just simply set about to care for the person right in front of her in the best way she could. And in doing that, she fulfilled the task that God had given to her. And she allowed God to do the rest. If he could use what she did for greater purposes, so be it. But she knew that her role was only simply to love and care for those who were dying, those who were lonely, those who were abandoned, and to bring them Jesus. When she did that, she helped heal their broken hearts. She helped continue the ministry of Jesus begun so long ago in that synagogue in Capernaum. So I think in the end, the scriptures today remind us of a simple truth that the spiritual life is not a theory. It's something we must live, something we must put into practice. And we could do that by, first of all, knowing who we are, knowing what our role is, and fulfilling it faithfully, and practicing those simple spiritual practices again and again, day in and day out, so that we can always live as signs of God's presence in this world. And when we get a little weary, a little tired, a little too overworked with it all, we can say to the Lord, "Are we there yet? How much longer, Lord? When, O Lord, will you come?"